There is a cave in the Arizona desert where the ground still runs warm, or so the old-timers swear, and the people who once explored it walked out carrying human skulls to sell as souvenirs. That is where this list ends. Before we get there, we'll cross a state that looks empty on a map, but isn't empty on the ground. A village so remote its mail still travels by mule. A jail that has been sliding down a mountain for a century, and a valley where two families turned neighbors into corpses over a herd of sheep. Every fact here has been checked against historical societies, newspapers, and county records. And the last entry is the one that still keeps historians arguing over where the legend ends and the truth begins. This is the countdown of the 10 weirdest and most isolated towns in Arizona. If you like the corners of America that most people drive straight past, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because we've got plenty more of these hidden places waiting. And while you're at it, drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. Now let's start at number 10. Number 10 is a town that is famous for having almost nothing in it, and that is not a joke, because the town is literally called Nothing. Nothing, Arizona sits on U.S. Route 93, on the long, sun-bleached stretch of highway between Wickenburg and Kingman, the same road that carries traffic between Phoenix and Las Vegas. It was founded in 1977 by a miner named Richard Buddy Kenworthy, who built a gas station, a small market, and a garage to catch travelers on that lonely highway. At its absolute peak, Nothing had 4 residents. 4. A sign once stood over the town reading that the citizens of Nothing were full of hope, faith, and belief in the work ethic, and that through the years they had worked at nothing. For nothing. A 1988 fire tore through Kenworthy's businesses, and though he rebuilt, the town never really recovered. It has changed hands since, been the subject of a failed pizza stand and a Father's Day publicity stunt from a real estate company, and today it stands boarded up behind rusting barbed wire. A ghost town so committed to its own name that even the Arizona Department of Transportation includes it on its list of the state's strangest places. It is a monument to a town that tried to be something out here in the emptiness, and honestly could not quite manage it. But not every town in this state failed quietly. Some of them left behind color instead of silence, and that brings us to number 9. Number 9 is Chloride, tucked into a fold of the Surbat Mountains about 23 miles northwest of Kingman. Chloride holds a title that sounds almost impossible for a ghost town. It is the oldest continuously inhabited mining settlement in the state of Arizona, founded around 1863 after prospectors found silver chloride in the surrounding hills. At its height, more than 2,000 people lived here, working across roughly 75 mines. When the price of silver collapsed and the mines shut down in 1944, Chloride should have died like so many of its neighbors. Instead, it did something strange. In the 1960s, a young miner and artist named Roy Purcell hiked into the hills east of town and, using little more than house paint and imagination, covered a cluster of massive boulders in surreal, mystical scenes. Those chloride murals still exist today, faded and repainted more than once, a psychedelic explosion of color rising out of bare desert rock. The town's post office, opened in the 1800s, is still the longest continuously operating post office in Arizona, and its Baptist church claims the same distinction for houses of worship. The town cemetery is dotted with graves marked by rusted telephones and homemade folk art instead of traditional headstones, part of a wider tradition of junk art that decorates almost every occupied home in Chloride today. Around 200 to 300 people still call Chloride home, many of them artists and retirees who like the quiet. It is proof that isolation does not always mean decay. Sometimes it just means nobody is around to tell you that painting the desert is a strange thing to do. And speaking of strange things nobody expected to survive, our next stop is currently overrun by descendants of pack animals nobody wanted anymore. Number 8 is Oatman, another Route 66 relic. This one sitting in the Black Mountains near the California border. Oatman began as a gold camp, and by some estimates its mines produced more than $36 million in gold before they ran dry. A fire tore through the town in 1921, destroying most of its wooden buildings, but sparing one adobe structure, the Oatman Hotel, built in 1902. That hotel is where, according to hotel records and long local tradition, Clark Gable and Carol Lombard spent their wedding night in March of 1939, right after marrying in nearby Kingman. But the real residents of Oatman today are not people. When the mines shut down for good during World War II, the miners simply turned their pack burros loose into the surrounding hills. Those animals never left. Their descendants now wander down into Oatman's main street every morning, nosing through shop doors and sidewalk railings. More numerous by far than the roughly 100 humans who actually live here. By some counts, the burro population in the surrounding hills has grown to nearly 2,000 animals, several times what land managers consider healthy for the area. And wildlife officials have had to launch campaigns just to stop tourists from overfeeding the ones that wander into town looking for treats. It is a mining town that outlived its mines, propped up by wooden sidewalks, staged shootouts for visitors, and a herd of donkeys that never got the memo that the gold rush ended 80 years ago. From donkeys taking over a ghost town, we moved to something even stranger. A city that was never supposed to be a ghost town at all, because it was never supposed to be finished. Number 7 is Arcosanti, rising out of the high desert about 70 miles north of Phoenix. This one is not a relic of the Old West. It is the unfinished dream of an Italian architect named Paolo Soleri, who studied under Frank Lloyd Wright before settling in Arizona and developing a philosophy he called arcology, a fusion of architecture and ecology. Beginning in 1970, Soleri and waves of student volunteers began pouring concrete into earthen molds on this remote mesa, building a self-sustained, car-free city meant to eventually house 5,000 people. Newsweek magazine once called it the most important urban experiment of its era. Decades of construction later, Arcosanti has never held more than around 100 residents at any given time. Its apple-shaped structures and bronze foundry still stand, strange and futuristic against the desert scrub, funded in part by the sale of hand-cast bronze wind bells that residents still produce on site. A monument to an idea that outpaced what one small community could actually build. And there is a darker layer to this story too. After Soleri's death in 2013, former residents came forward with allegations of sexual abuse against him, forcing the foundation that runs Arcosanti to publicly reckon with the legacy of the very man who designed it. So today, Arcosanti exists as something genuinely rare, a utopian city, half-built, half-abandoned, and permanently complicated by the man who dreamed it up. If a half-finished utopia feels remote, our next entry is isolated in a much older, much more literal sense. Number 6 takes us almost to the Mexican border, to a town called Ajo. Ajo grew up around one of the largest open-pit copper mines in the country, and in the 1910s, the mining company built something unusual for a remote desert outpost. A grand Spanish colonial plaza, complete with arched walkways and a bandstand, meant to give workers a taste of civic beauty in the middle of nowhere. When the mine eventually wound down operations, Ajo could have crumbled the way so many company towns do. Instead, artists moved in. Today, the plaza is ringed with murals and galleries, run in large part through community art projects. Its old company offices converted into exhibition spaces, and rotating street art painted directly onto the walls of buildings that once stood empty. What makes Io so unusual is the combination. A town built by a corporation's utopian vision, sitting only a few miles from an international border, surrounded by nothing but open Sonoran desert in every direction, that has reinvented itself as a quiet arts town almost nobody outside Arizona has heard of. It is proof that even a town built for industry can end up somewhere nobody quite expected. But not every abandoned Arizona town reinvented itself peacefully. Some of them are remembered because of what was done to the people who tried to enforce the law there. Number 5 is Vulture City, about 12 miles outside Wickenburg, and this is where the tone of this list starts to shift. Vulture City grew up around the Vulture mine, discovered by prospector Henry Wickenburg in 1863, which would go on to produce more than 340,000 ounces of gold, making it one of the richest gold mines in Arizona's history. At its peak, nearly 5,000 people lived and worked here. But out where the mine was, there was no sheriff, no judge, and no jail. So when miners were caught stealing gold ore, a practice known as high grading, justice was carried out under a single ironwood tree standing near Wickenburg's old stone cabin. According to long-standing local accounts, 18 men were hanged from that tree over the years the mine operated. Historians who have studied the site closely note that some of these stories were exaggerated over the decades to draw in tourists, and that no formal records survive to confirm every hanging attributed to it. What is documented is that the tree itself still stands today, 200 to 300 years old, at the center of a mining camp with no courthouse and no mercy, and that visitors and paranormal investigators alike still report cold spots and unexplained whispers near its trunk after dark. The Vulture mine finally closed in 1942 under wartime restrictions on non-essential gold mining, and the town emptied out behind it. Today it has been restored as a historic site people can walk through, hanging tree and all. That puts us at the halfway mark of this list, and if you're the kind of person who likes finding out what really happened in the places most people just drive past, this channel is basically built for you. So take a second and subscribe if you haven't already, because there are plenty more of these buried across the country. Now, back to the desert, because the next entry shows what happened when the law existed, but simply could not keep up with a feud that swallowed an entire valley. Number 4 brings us to Pleasant Valley, in the shadow of the Mogollon Rim, and to the small settlement of Young, Arizona, which sits at the heart of the deadliest range war in American history. Beginning in 1882, two ranching families, the Grahams and the Tewksburys, fell into a dispute that started, by most accounts, over a division of cattle. It grew worse when sheep were introduced into the valley in the mid-1880s, a move the cattle-raising Grahams saw as an existential threat to their grazing land. What followed was a decade of ambushes, cattle rustling, and masked man lynchings that historians still cannot fully untangle, because so much of it played out through unsolved killings, with no surviving witnesses willing to talk. Estimates of the total dead range from 20 to as many as 50 men, an almost unbelievable toll for a war fought entirely between neighbors in one isolated valley, with hired guns, sheepmen, and local lawmen eventually dragged into a conflict that started as a private falling out over stolen cattle. One of its most brutal moments came in 1887. When Graham allies murdered John Tewksbury and his son on the Tewksbury family ranch, then stood guard over the bodies to prevent a proper burial. The feud finally ended in August of 1892, when the last surviving Graham brother was shot dead in broad daylight in Tempe. more than 100 miles from where the whole thing started. Pleasant Valley's bloodshed became so infamous that historians say it helped convince the federal government Arizona Territory was not yet civilized enough for statehood, a status Arizona would not receive for another 20 years. Today, Young remains a tiny, quiet community, and it takes a historical marker standing along the road to tell you that this peaceful high country once buried more men than most Old West gunfights combined. From a feud that consumed an entire valley, we move up onto a mountainside, to a town that earned a reputation so bad that even the newspapers of its own era couldn't resist naming it. Number 3 is Jerome. Perched at a steep angle on the side of Cleopatra Hill above the Verde Valley. Copper was discovered here in the 1870s, and by 1883 the United Verde Copper Company had turned a rough mining camp into a boomtown that would eventually swell to around 15,000 residents, larger at its peak than the city of Phoenix. Because roughly 80% of the population were single men working the mines, saloons, gambling halls, and brothels multiplied fast enough that a local newspaper crowned Jerome the wickedest town in the West in 1903, a nickname the town has never quite shaken. Jerome's decline was not just economic. It was literally physical. Mining companies dynamited so extensively beneath the town that the ground itself began to shift. And in 1938, the town's jail, a concrete building constructed in 1905, broke loose from its foundation and began sliding down the mountainside. It eventually came to rest 225 feet from where it was built, sitting squarely in the middle of a road that residents simply rerouted around it rather than remove the jail. The town's hospital, now the Jerome Grand Hotel, recorded thousands of deaths over its decades of operation, a grim statistic that today fuels most of the ghost tours that walk its halls. Miles of mining tunnels still run beneath the streets, and locals will tell you that entire buildings have simply vanished into sinkholes over the decades as the old shafts settled. When the last mine finally closed in 1953, Jerome's population collapsed to under 100 people almost overnight. It survived only because artists began moving into the empty buildings in the 1960s. Turning America's largest ghost town as it now bills itself into a functioning community again. Jerome earned its wicked reputation through greed, violence, and a town that literally could not stay still on the mountain it was built on. Our next stop earns its reputation through something rarer, total, complete removal from everything else. Number 2 is Supai. And if you want to understand real isolation in the United States, this is the place that keeps showing up on every serious list of the most remote communities in the country. Supai sits at the bottom of Havasu Canyon, a side branch of the Grand Canyon, and it is the capital of the Havasupai Reservation, home to the Havasupai tribe, whose name translates to people of the blue-green waters. There are no roads into Supai. None. The only ways in are an 8-mile hike down a punishing switchback trail with more than 2,000 feet of elevation loss, a mule or horseback ride, or a helicopter flight that depends entirely on weather. Mail is still delivered by mule train, making Supai the last place in the United States where the Postal Service relies on pack animals rather than any kind of vehicle. Fewer than 500 people live here full-time, in a village with a single school, a small clinic, and dirt roads where horses and dogs outnumber the handful of ATVs that serve as local transportation. Visitors come for some of the most striking turquoise waterfalls in North America, including the famous Havasu Falls, cascading over red rock in a canyon most Americans will never set foot in. But that same canyon geography that makes Supai beautiful also makes it dangerous. because Havasu Creek drains an enormous watershed of desert terrain with almost nowhere for floodwater to spread out. The canyon is prone to sudden, violent flash floods. Major flooding struck in 2008, 2018, 2022, and again in August 2024, when a wall of water tore through the campground and trail system with almost no warning, forcing the National Guard to airlift more than 100 people to safety. One woman lost her life in that 2024 flood, swept into the Colorado River by the current. It is a sobering reminder that the same remoteness that makes Supai feel untouched by the modern world also makes it one of the hardest places in America to reach help when something goes wrong. And now, we come to the town that started this whole list, the one built directly on top of a story so dark that even the people who study it professionally still cannot agree on where the history stops and the legend begins. Number 1 is Two Guns, a scatter of stone ruins just off Interstate 40 between Flagstaff and Winslow, and it might be the single strangest, most layered ghost town in the entire state. The story most visitors hear starts in 1878, when Apache raiders were said to have attacked Navajo camps near the Little Colorado River. According to the legend, pursuing Navajo warriors eventually tracked the raiders to a hidden limestone cave system along the rim of Canyon Diablo, lit fires at its entrance, and killed everyone trapped inside as they tried to escape the smoke. Local tradition holds that 42 Apache men died in that cave, which has been known ever since as the Apache Death Cave. But here is where the story gets genuinely strange. A researcher who dug into the site's history found that the earliest known detailed account of this exact massacre only appears in a slim, 28-page book published in 1968, nearly 90 years after the events supposedly took place. That means the version of the story most people repeat today may have been shaped as much by 20th century tourism as by 19th century fact. And historians are honest about not being able to separate the two with confidence. What is documented beyond dispute is what happened after. In 1925, a man who went by the nickname Crazy Thunder leased the land, built a roadside zoo stocked with mountain lions and snakes along the canyon rim, and ran paid tours down into the cave itself, at one point even selling skulls he claimed to have found inside. He reportedly went so far as to have fake ruins built near the cave entrance to make the tours feel more dramatic. The zoo, the trading post, and the tourist complex that grew up around Two Guns burned down more than once over the following decades and were struck by a final decisive fire in 1971 that ended the town for good, leaving the old service station a burned, graffiti-covered shell that still stands beside the highway today. In between, the site was hit by a string of business failures, a bridge realignment in 1938 that redirected Route 66 traffic away from the town entirely, and enough general misfortune, from collapsed ventures to unexplained accidents, that generations of visitors have simply concluded the whole property is cursed. Whatever the truth of the original 1878 story, something about this stretch of canyon has genuinely destroyed every business ever built on top of it. Today, all that is left is crumbling stone, an old bridge listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and a cave you can still walk into if you are willing to bring a flashlight and ignore just how many things have gone wrong here since anyone first started charging admission. That is the countdown. 10 towns across a state most people think they already know, from a roadside joke called nothing to a cave that has outlasted every business ever built to try to profit from it. In between, we crossed a valley that buried more men than most Old West gunfights combined, a mountain town that quite literally could not stop sliding downhill. and a canyon village where the same isolation that draws thousands of visitors a year can turn deadly in a matter of minutes when the water starts to rise. Arizona's deserts don't just hide old mines and empty highways. They hide entire histories that most of the country has never heard, sitting quietly a few miles off the interstate, waiting for someone to ask a local historian the right question. If you want to keep exploring the parts of America that never make it into the guidebooks, stick around, because we've got a lot more of these waiting for you. And we'll see you on the next one.